This is United States History 202, Presentation 17, Domestic Issues 1948 to 1974. So what we're going to talk about are the major issues in the United States, both social and cultural history and political history in this particular period of time, generally regarded as the 1950s and the 1960s. So let's get started. So the major issues in this particular period of time, again, social, cultural issues and political issues, had to do with the size and scope of the central government. That's going to be a general theme following the New Deal of the 1940s. We'll take a look at American prosperity and affluence, looking at the new American middle class, 1950s pop culture. We'll talk about presidential politics, including the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and the counterculture and political corruption, which is basically the 1960s. So let's start with some presidential politics. And, of course, the president in office at this time, when this period began, 1948, was Harry Truman. He was actually in office from 1945 to 1953. And Truman, remember, came into office because Franklin Roosevelt died in April of 1945. And so Truman took over as vice president. He would win his own election in 1948. Now, Truman was famous for executive authority, meaning that he believed that all responsibility for any decisions in the executive department stopped with Harry Truman. But he was also a New Dealer, though he had his own program called the Fair Deal. So he was a New Deal progressive Democrat. This involved increases in the minimum wage, expansion in Social Security benefits. National health insurance was actually floated here in the 1940s, and this was a dream of the progressive left, really from the 1940s until it finally happened in 2011, and then implementation this year in 2013. He was a proponent of civil rights legislation, and you would have in the 1950s a housing boom, which was actually created by easy credit policies following World War II, which led to a bubble and then later a bust again. So anytime you have the Fed expanding credit and expanding the monetary supply, you are going to have a period of time where you have a bubble, and that bubble will inevitably burst. Now, 1948 is an election year, and Americans were generally not very happy with Harry Truman. He had done some pretty aggressive things as president, nationalizing steel mills, his civil rights record. People find this hard to believe, but in the 1940s, civil rights for many Americans was not a frontline issue, and particularly in the South, they weren't happy with his record on civil rights and his promotion of civil rights legislation. There was distrust over increased federal power, higher taxes. There was an economic dip following World War II, so it looked like Truman was going to lose the election. The Republicans had nominated Thomas Dewey, and he seemed to be a lock to win the election. But right at the end, Truman will go on a whistle-stop tour. He'll get on a train and go from town to town and campaign against Thomas Dewey. And he starts painting Thomas Dewey as this very right-wing kind of guy. Thomas Dewey is actually a moderate Republican. He wasn't very conservative. He was actually, very much in favor of the New Deal with some modifications. But Truman is going to paint him as this guy that's, against the New Deal, and it's going to work. Now, Truman also had opposition in his own party, sort of. In the South, you had something called the Dixiecrats, or the States' Rights Democrats, and they nominated their own candidate, J. Strom Thurmond, of South Carolina. And this is going to pull a lot of votes away in the South from Harry Truman. Truman won in a very close election, actually miscalled by the media. So again, people thought Dewey was going to win, and it was going to be a sure thing we'd have a President Dewey. But we get a President Truman again. And as I said, miscalled by the media. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But here you have the 1948 election. You can see Truman doesn't get 50% of the vote, but he does get over 50% of the Electoral College. And there's the very famous paper, the Chicago Daily Tribune, called the election for Dewey before it was over. And, of course, Truman wins. So Truman will serve one more term, and then in 1952, we'll have another presidential election, and Dwight Eisenhower will be elected the 34th President of the United States. He, of course, is the hero of World War II, and whoever Dwight Eisenhower ran against was going to lose. Eisenhower was that popular. This is the guy that won the war in Europe, defeated the Nazis. And he was actually courted by both the Democrats and Republicans, and he decided he was going to be a Republican. He's a very moderate Republican, what they often call country club or Rockefeller Republicans, very, very moderate. His domestic program is going to show that. But he would run as a Republican in 52 and 56 and win both times, and landslides. His opponent in both elections was Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, and he was sort of the sacrificial lamb. Anyone who ran against Eisenhower was going to lose, and so Stevenson, his father was actually vice president, but he's going to lose in both elections in a landslide. He's often called the egghead because he was an intellectual, often alienated voters with his perceived arrogance. He would later serve as in the United Nations as an ambassador to the United Nations for the United States. But here's the 52 election. You can see 83% of the Electoral College going to Eisenhower in 52 and 86% going in 56. So, Eisenhower's type of conservatism was called dynamic conservatism back in the 50s. We know this today as compassionate conservatism. So you're going to see an expansion of the New Deal basically in a variety of ways, but one of the things was expansion of Social Security benefits. Now this is going to cover more and more retirees, and of course this is an issue now because Social Security is essentially bankrupt, and it's there are discussions about how you're going to reform entitlement programs, and with more and more people retiring and fewer people paying into the system, it's leaving the system unbalanced. So this is why there's a lot of discussion about Social Security today. But this is when it all begins. You start to see Social Security expanded out from what it was originally intended to be, which was essentially a pension for people who were disabled, to an old age pension. So when you got this when you retired. He also was in favor of what was called the Federal Highway Act of 1956. This created the interstate system. So the modern interstate system that we all drive on today was created during the Eisenhower administration. And Eisenhower wanted it because he thought, well, this is exactly what they have in Germany in the Autobahn, so we need this thing here in the United States. And essentially that's what it is. It's the American Autobahn. But he sold the system in terms of national defense. But today it's much more than that. In fact, about I think it's somewhere around 90% of all commerce that's conducted in the United States is centered around interstates. So the interstate system now is kind of the veins of the United States in terms of transportation for goods and services. 1960, of course, is a presidential election year, and the Democrats would nominate John F. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy was not the first choice for the Kennedy family to become president. In fact, his older brother, Joe Kennedy, was being groomed for that. But Joe Kennedy died in a war accident during World War II, and so then this fell on John Kennedy. Joe Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, he's also Joe Kennedy, was an extremely corrupt politician. Well, not really a politician, a guy who was a puppet master, so to speak. He had his hands in all kinds of things in Boston. He played kingmaker there. He had a lot of money. He would manipulate the press, was anti-Semitic, was not a very moral individual, and so the Kennedys, all the Kennedys, had the same type of personality. And this image of Camelot, which has been so foisted upon the American population of this great political dynasty and wonderful family, is just all false. The Kennedys were extremely immoral, corrupt family, and have all kinds of problems even to this day. Kennedy, of course, lived from 1917 to 1963, will be assassinated after being elected president in 1960. He's from Massachusetts, and really a member of this young World War II generation. Served in the war, in the Navy, in fact. And then he spent a lot of time when he was obtaining his law degree, riding around his convertible, getting STDs, and not really learning much law, but that didn't matter because his father was going to get him involved in politics anyways. He had a very seedy background, but a very polished politician. His opponent in 1960 was Richard Nixon, the vice president from California. He wasn't much older than Kennedy. He's only 4 years older. But he looked older, particularly on TV. In fact, the first televised debate in American history is going to take place in this 1960 election cycle. And Richard Nixon refused to wear makeup. He looked pale compared to John Kennedy, who looked tanned. And they called him the Bronzed Warrior. Kennedy had a nice television personality. Nixon did not. Anyone who listened to the debates on the radio thought Nixon won, but anyone who watched them thought Kennedy won. So that is going to matter in 1960, and you can see even the impact of that even to this day. Now, was this a stolen election? There were disputed returns, voting returns in Texas and Illinois, and just so happens that John Kennedy's vice presidential nominee, Lyndon Johnson's from Texas, and you had dead people voting in Chicago and Illinois. So It's a very close election, and if Nixon had pressed it, he might have been able to show that there was voter fraud, but he decided not to and concede. And so here's the 1960 election. You can see Kennedy only gets about 100,000 more votes than Nixon, and if he doesn't win Illinois and Texas, then Nixon wins the election. So that's how important those two states were in this particular election cycle. So John F. Kennedy had his own domestic agenda called the New Frontier, which will be an expansion of federal power. There will be increases in the minimum wage and federal programs for economic assistance. But the most famous element of the Kennedy administration in terms of domestic policy is his assassination in November of 1963. Now, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories revolving around this, and we can spend a whole course pretty much probably talking about these conspiracy theories. I've supplied the link for the Zapruder film, which is the most famous film showing the assassination. You can have some fun going out on the internet and looking these things up, but I think that just on the side note that there's probably some merit to some of these theories, though no one will probably ever know conclusively. This will always be up in the air, but there are several books out there promoting that Kennedy was not killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, that it was somebody else, or maybe multiple number of shooters. You can go out and look for yourself, but I've provided that Zapruder film, which is an interesting film to watch. So after that, Lyndon B. Johnson is sworn in on board Air Force One in 1963. In fact, one of the conspiracy theories revolves around Lyndon Johnson actually being behind the assassination. Johnson would serve until 1969. He, of course, is from Texas, and his great legislative agenda was called the Great Society, which will dramatically expand the federal government. So you see the implementation of Medicare, Medicaid, welfare. He called this the war on poverty. But one of the reasons why the United States has to come off a precious metal standard during the Nixon administration is because of guns and butter. We're going to spend a lot of money on economic assistance and a lot of money on war, which is the guns part. The butter is the economic assistance for lower income families in the United States. And even looking at our federal budget today, there's been studies done and how much of our budget goes into social welfare programs. So there's a dramatic expansion in social welfare programs here during the Great Society of the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson was also known for what was called the treatment. He would get in your face and cry, laugh, yell, whatever he had to do to get you to vote his way. So he was very interested in bully politics. 1964 rolls around, and Johnson's going to be opposed by Barry Goldwater of Arizona, the Republican nominee. He's more of a libertarian than anything else, and he was often called Mr. Conservative. Now, Johnson's going to win in a landslide because he runs on his attachment to Kennedy, kind of finishing the Kennedy administration. But he is going to use some pretty dirty politics, and that's where I put the Daisy advertisement there. This ad ran one time, and you can click on it and watch it, but you can see how dramatic it is and what kind of impact that might have had on the perception of Barry Goldwater. But 1964 is also interesting because of the flip. This is the first time since Reconstruction that the South votes Republican, the Deep South votes Republican in a presidential election cycle. So Goldwater, as a libertarian, believed in decentralization, believed in limited central government, and so the South was on board with that, and so they're going to vote for Goldwater over Johnson. And there you can see that. But Johnson's going to win in a landslide. Now, 1968 rolls around. Johnson decides not to run again because of his growing unpopularity due to the Vietnam War primarily. So the Republicans will nominate Richard Nixon, the Democrats Hubert Humphrey. There will be a third party, the American Independent Party, with George Wallace of Alabama running in the American Independent ticket. This is a very violent period of time. Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated during a campaign stop in Los Angeles. He was the presumptive front runner in 1968, but when he's killed, Hubert Humphrey gets the nomination. Martin Luther King was assassinated. You had riots at the 1968 Democrat Convention in Chicago. So there's a lot of violence here and a lot of civil unrest in this period of time. A lot of it had to do with the Vietnam War and the opposition to that. But here's the 68 election. You can see Nixon wins a very close popular vote. Close to 1 million in the popular vote, and close in the Electoral College as well. And keep that in mind, because in 60 he lost in a very close vote. 68 he wins in a very close vote. So when 1972 rolls around, he's not going to pull out any stops in the 72 election, or at least the Republican Party's not going to. Richard Nixon's often seen as a very conservative guy, but there was a tremendous expansion of the federal government here. So he supports affirmative action, or at least affirmative action legislation is passed during his administration. which involves also busing, which we'll talk about in presentation 19. You get the creation of new federal agencies, things like OSHA and the EPA, which are these regulatory agencies which have a tremendous amount of control over the American economy. Nixon abandoned any precious metal standard because he had to pay for all these things that were passed previously, though he will win a landslide re-election in 72. And Nixon's going to capitalize on something he calls the silent majority. These people that go out and work every day, pay their taxes, but yet they don't protest and all these other things. So he capitalizes on that and pulls the South into his sphere of influence, and so he wins in a landslide in 72, but he has to resign in 1974 because of Watergate. So Nixon was seen as corrupt. Watergate, Nixon actually had nothing to do with Watergate in terms of the actual break-in the Watergate Hotel itself, but Nixon is involved in trying to cover it up, which is where the heat comes. And so a lot of stuff comes out about Nixon. He claims executive privilege, which is a farce. There is no executive privilege, not in the way Nixon wanted it. And the guys that were involved in the Watergate break-in would later be put in jail. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories about that, who these people were, why they were breaking in the Watergate Hotel, what they were trying to cover up. And a lot of this actually has to do with the CIA. And so that's also an interesting caveat to this entire process. But Nixon will resign in 1974. And there's the 72 election. So you can see, pulls out all the stops, wins a crushing landslide victory over over George McGovern in 1972. All right, well, let's talk about the 1950s. So the 50s really are from like 1948 to 1964. So it's a longer period than just 10 years. And we're going to look at the new American middle class and suburban life. We'll talk about leisure, the automobile, television, and the creation of modern pop culture. So first and foremost, this is often called the golden age of Hollywood. You have, for example, many of the famous American actors and actresses of the period included people like Charlton Heston, there in the Ten Commandments, Gary Cooper, Grace Kelly, Bette Davis, Ronald Reagan. President Reagan was actually a 1950s actor and a very popular one. However, the most famous actor of this period from the 50s into the 60s was John Wayne. Famous for his westerns and war movies, he really set the American standard for masculinity, which was derived from his characters. He's a very conservative individual, and these characters were individualistic, strong, tough guys, frontiersmen. And so anyone growing up in the 50s and 60s wanted to be like John Wayne if you were a boy. You wanted to be like that guy. You wanted to be the guy that was in the Green Berets or the westerns. This was the guy that everyone wanted to be like. And then, of course, you had sex symbols like Marilyn Monroe, the first major American sex symbol. And she, in fact, made Hugh Hefner famous with Playboy magazine. So you had this element coming out in the 1960s as well. So, and Marilyn Monroe, of course, was attached to the Kennedys and others. This is why she became such a major figure in the 1950s. It's also the period of time when you get rock and roll. So Bill Haley and the Comets had what's considered to be the first rock song with Rock Around the Clock. But you had all these other artists who I've given links to so you can hear their music. And many people would say that rock and roll was kind of this influence in breaking down racial barriers because you had black artists for the first time being recognized by white mainstream audiences. And so that's going to help create a climate where you don't have as much racial, or at least more acceptance for different races in the United States. Of course, the king of rock and roll is Elvis Presley. Really changed the direction of music and the target audience, meaning teenage girls. And so Presley became the most recognized figure of the rock and roll era in the 1950s. American literature had several different elements to it in the 1950s, but Jack Kerouac was a proponent of the beatnik literature, which is the prelude to the hippies coming out of Massachusetts. J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, about teenage angst. Tennessee Williams, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. These are about social issues, homosexuality. Lorraine Hansberry, A Raisin in the Sun, about racism. Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 is kind of a dystopic look at burning books and what a big government can do. And then Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, same thing. It's a libertarian novel. But all these people were, promoting different social or political agendas here in the 1950s. Of course, it's also the beginning of the classic American car, 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, picture there. So when you think of 1950s automobiles, you might think of that. 1950s was also the first period where you had television being mass-produced, so people were moving away from the radio into the television set, and so they get their news that way, their entertainment that way, and so this is the beginning of the television culture in America. Of course, televisions were a lot different back then, and you didn't have very many stations, but I did put up there a link to the first episode of The Twilight Zone, which was a very popular program in the late 50s, early 60s. And, of course, we can't get around the 1950s without talking about some local history in Phoenix City. Phoenix City was well known as Sin City in that time, and the Sin City of the South. But Las Vegas wasn't there yet, so Phoenix City was that, and was well known for corruption, vice, scandal. You had the murder of Albert Love Patterson in June of 1954, which put the gambling element, the crime syndicate, on the front page of many major publications across the United States. And so in 1954, the city would be cleaned up. It also brought John Patterson, Albert Patterson's son, to the governor's mansion at one point. Of course, they're from Phoenix City. Now, other developments in the 50s included air conditioning and the erosion of the front porch culture, so more and more people began to move inside, particularly in the South, because of they were getting out of the heat. More people were moving to suburban neighborhoods, so that the suburbanization of America is going to change things in your urban areas. It's more and more people are moving out of the cities and into the suburbs. The polio vaccines invented by Salk, the discovery of DNA, and the first organ transplants in this period of time. Now, if you say the 1960s, the first thing that's probably going to come to mind is hippies. So this is the counterculture. Hippies in the anti-war movement. It's also the period of time known as the sexual revolution, and we'll talk about music and film, the New Left, and of course perception and reality in the 60s. So hippies are often called the counterculture. Drug use would escalate among young Americans, principally marijuana and LSD. They were told to question authority. You had long-haired men and free women, and the high point of the hippie movement was Woodstock in the summer of 1969. When you had all these hippies converge on Woodstock, New York, for a big open-air music festival. But this is, typical image of hippies. This was a small percentage of the population, though. When you think of hippies, but most Americans in the 60s were not hippies, though you did have an element that was. The sexual revolution in the 1960s, the birth control pill and free love. So you saw more nudity on films and sex in the cinema and other taboo areas. You saw nudist colonies. You had John Lennon's 1969 bed-in with Yoko Ono there, and the phrase was "make love, not war." So you had a much more open sexual society beginning in the 1960s, particularly with the breakdown of traditional morals when it came to women. Music, of course, in the 60s is well known, and I've given you a number of different genres here in the 60s and some links to their music. But you had the British invasion with the Beatles, you had psychedelic rock and the San Francisco sound, Motown, folk music, outlaw country, even the beginnings of metal music with Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. Films were more socially oriented in the 60s, so the counterculture and the space race were two hot themes. Easy Rider in 1969 is a film about the counterculture, and then 2001: A Space Odyssey came out in 1968, which is the space race, outer space, and what war was going to be like in 2001, something like the film. And then, of course, To Kill a Mockingbird, 1962, which is about social issues, racism, essentially. The New Left had a changing liberal agenda. The New Left retained economic Marxism, but they applied the concept to other social crusades, such as the civil rights movement, feminism, environmentalism, the animal rights movement. They call this social justice. So the social justice movement is going to come out of the 1960s, which is still around today. There was the anti-war movement, which I say is hypocritical because when these people were in power, they were ardent, interventionists and using the military for their own means. But they all believed in government activism. So it was ask what your government can do for you. You're going to see the tremendous expansion of government in this period of time. In summary, the average middle-class Americans were more affluent in the 50s and 60s. You did see a changing society, the erosion of traditional customs and norms. This is really where it began. But in this period of time, most Americans were not part of the counterculture. They were part of the silent majority, those, again, that went to work, paid their taxes, didn't protest. They were not hippies. And this is what Nixon capitalized on in the 72 election, which allowed him to win. All right, so that's presentation 17. I'll see you for presentation 18.